Hello and welcome, my name is Meepless, they, he, she, and today's pick is The Strange by Jérôme Ruillier. Originally published in French in 2016, it was translated by Helge Dascher and published in 2018 by John and Quarterly. This volume also concludes with a word from Amnesty International from 2015. So recent and yet so long ago. Of course, this means it was apparently even more of a pleasant surprise to stumble across this title in my library's new acquisitions page not that long ago. Content notes for xenophobia, family separation, and police crackdowns. Keywords that came to mind reading this very concise and impactful volume were exploitation, colluding, and humanizing. The publisher summary is, quote, the story of one undocumented immigrant's journey told by the people who employ him, feed him, and report on him. The Strange follows an unnamed, undocumented immigrant who tries to forge a new life in a Western country where he doesn't speak the language. The story is deftly told through myriad viewpoints, as each narrator recounts a situation in which they cross paths with the newly arrived foreigner. Strange shows one person's struggle to adapt while dealing with the often brutal and unforgiving attitudes of the employers, neighbors, and strangers who populate this new land. Ruillier employs a bold visual approach of colored pencil drawings complemented by a stark, limited palette of red, orange, and green backgrounds. Its beautiful simplicity represents the almost childlike hope and promise that is often associated with new beginnings, but as he implicitly suggests, it's a promise that can shatter at a moment's notice when the threat of being deported is a daily and terrifying reality. End quote. Looking at Jérôme Ruillier, he was born in Madagascar in 1966, shortly after they gained independence from France, but has spent most of his adult life in France. Ruillier started out as a children's book illustrator, but this is not his first graphic novel, just his first translated into English. So while I can't attest to the quality of it, I would note that he seems very purposeful and mission-driven in his graphic novels, having previously authored/illustrated a volume about the first days in the life of a child with disabilities, based off of his family's experience, and an adaptation based on interviews conducted of North African immigrants to France. Looking at the writing side of The Strange, Ruillier goes a few steps beyond just putting words to page in his use of language to further the story, using illegible text to introduce the otherness of our main protagonist. This sense is increased by the way the story is told through the eyes of a series of strangers, each showing their perspective on the presence of our protagonist. Some are welcome, many are naive, and some are outright hostile. A resoundingly pro-immigrant, undocumented or otherwise, volume, Ruillier clearly demonstrates the ways in which our protagonist is exploited and milked for value, all while creating a world in which this person could be leaving one of many, if not any, place, and trying to move to another that will not have him. The summary says that they are trying to move to the West, but it also reminds me of the experience of Mohammed al-Gharani in Guantanamo Kid, before he was kidnapped to Guantanamo, not to mention how global climate change will disrupt and intensify human movement internationally. Not terribly surprisingly, this volume is often compared to Sean Tan's The Arrival. Tan even blurbs the back, and I would not be surprised at all if The Arrival was an inspiration. You can see my perhaps uniquely critical review of The Arrival as feel-good ahistorical fluff in my video 6 Wordless Comics Profiled, which I will link appropriately. Perhaps needless to say at this point in my review, but I do feel like The Strange does everything right that I felt went wrong in The Arrival. Looking at the artwork, I felt like they came across equally as skillfully as the text. The choice to use the anthropomorphized creatures adds to the anonymity of the location, and the use of color and line are both very bold and strategic, building up the mood of the story. Looking at the intersections that I like to explore and highlight in each of my reviews, we've already talked about it, but it is interesting how place can both be fairly central to the story but also be so anonymous. Similarly, race is and is not a thing. Our character looks very different from everyone else around them, but it doesn't seem to directly tie to any real-world equivalent. This does mean there is no exploration of some of the particulars of how Black immigrants, for example, documented and undocumented, are targeted compared to others. Gender and sexuality are more pinned down, with our protagonist being a man who goes ahead of his wife and daughter, is eventually reunited, only to find themselves separated again. Diversity is sacrificed to tell what is probably perceived as more of an everyman story. Class is perhaps the most important aspect of the story, as I already mentioned. The exploitation of this seeming underclass by the documented and the citizen is very well explored, in my humble opinion. Looking at disability versus ability, about halfway through, Mr. Roberts briefly takes in our protagonist so he can cover for Mr. Roberts' carer being away. Taking all the advantage he can, Mr. Roberts does not actually pay our protagonist anything. Wrapping things up, this is a short, fast read that packs a strong punch. It's not the be-all, end-all, but does a lot of things better than I've come to expect. 4 stars. Bye all, keep reading, and remember all colonial settler states are a lie! And Literally Graphic is created on land that should be given back to the traditional landholders, which in this case is, to my knowledge, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, an Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation.